Well, welcome everybody to February's discussion of Dorothy Richardson's Pilgrimage. Today we're going to be discussing the second book in the set called Backwater, and we're delighted to have with us one of the world's premier experts on Richardson and everything pilgrimage related, Professor Scott McCracken, who is, among other things, he is the editor for this series, which is coming out from the Oxford editions of the Works of Dorothy Richardson. And he, in fact, was the lead for this volume 4, which is Pointed Roofs and Backwater in the first annotated edition of both of those books. Pointed Roofs, there was an annotated edition a few years ago. And I'm delighted because I have been without my pilgrimage books since June of last year when I packed them up in the UK and my wife and I moved back to the States. So I've got this, and I've got my lovely copy of the Dent edition from '67, which is, if you can get a set of these, which they're tough to find, but if you can find it, this is the keeper set so far until we get the rest of these out. And I guess what, we have 5 more to come?
That's right. Yeah.
Excellent. And I also have collected a fair amount of Richardsoniana. So I also have her Windows on Modernism letters collection and a few other things. So it's just nice to have access to these sorts of things because it gives me some of the material that I'm posting to sites, excerpts of things. And as you saw earlier this week, Scott was kind enough to let us extract a bit from his introduction to this edition from this first volume from the Oxford edition. So if first of all, I would welcome everybody to the discussion. I know this is a day where many of our minds are not on wonderful books, but on the troubles that our friends in the Ukraine are facing for thoroughly contemptible reasons. And I thoroughly understand if we're not entirely here, and this might be a somewhat distracted discussion. On the other hand, perhaps it's an escape that some of us need from what's going on in today's world. So what we'll do is I've invited Scott to kind of take the discussion, lead off with some remarks and however he wants to approach it. And then we'll open things up for discussion. You should have all seen that I distributed some excerpts that Scott had picked out, because I think we all loved Kristen's approach of having us jointly read from selections of the book. I mean, I love that, and I think we all appreciated it because, you know, that's one of the best ways to engage with the text, is to hear it, and particularly to hear it read by others. I think it's a real shame if one of the things we get out of this is somebody decides to produce an audiobook of the entire series. My gosh, that would be so great. And if we could get like Juliet Stevens to do it, it would be even better. There are a couple of versions on LibriVox. Yeah, they're only if you're desperate, in my opinion, but I might be biased about that. So with that, if there are no questions, it looks like everybody's managed to connect. Great. So I will turn it over to Scott. Actually, let me just step through a couple of things administrative. If I can just share my screen here for a sec. And so, of course, welcome. Hopefully you're getting something out of following. A lot of folks are following us on Twitter. It's not the only way you have to. I know if you're not into social media, that's, you know, certainly you're right. But it is a great avenue, and it's great to see people as they're reading through, finding passages that really get them excited, make them think, and sharing it with other people, because I think that's one of the great things about this collective reading process. Of course, I'm trying to support this through the readingpilgrimage.com website, where you can find material. I'll continue to post kind of the basic props of the process. So you'll see character lists each month for each book, also a brief synopsis of the plot, and then contemporary reviews and other things that may help you get access into the text. So we're here talking about Backwater, the second book in the novel, and published first in 1916. So it's worth reflecting that this book did come out when England and much of the world was in another difficult and troubled situation with the war, the First World War. And now I'll turn it over to Scott McCracken, who, I mean, I don't think we could ask for a better expert to talk about Backwater in particular, but also the entire work of pilgrimage and Dorothy Richardson's life and approach to her work. So with that, I will happily bring an end to this PowerPoint torture and turn it over to Scott.
Thank you so much, Brad. It's wonderful to see so many people here. As you know, Richardson has been neglected and very much a minority case for a minority taste, rather, for decades. So this is wonderful, and thank you for inviting me. It just struck me, actually, as Brad mentioned Ukraine, that and then of course the First World War, that a lot of the reviews for Backwater were published alongside advertisements for military uniforms, books that were about the war or about the Germans trying to understand the war, and of course war reports. And I mean, it's very easy to forget that when you read the actual text, that its reception was in a very, very troubled period indeed. I'd like to start just by thinking, given that you're doing this wonderful project of reading the whole of Pilgrimage in order, I'd just like to sort of pause and think a little bit about how the reader at the time would have approached the second volume, because at the time people were very used to the 3-volume novel, which was often circulated by libraries, and people would borrow one volume and then share it and then send it back to the library and so on. And so the kind of expectation of a lot of the reviewers and a lot of the readers was that this was a middle volume of a trilogy. And they kind of read it as such, and the expectation was, because it was a I'm going to move myself. Okay, the expectation was that that Miriam, because she was a young woman, would eventually become married, and that this rather bleak and a bit depressed period in her life would resolve itself through finding a man. And one of the things I want to talk about is how that doesn't happen, but clearly there's a lot going on with the young Miriam's sexuality and her kind of unresolved and to some extent unacknowledged desires in this volume. I mean, it's not a romance, but there's a lot of romance there beneath the surface, if you like. I'd say when I first read Pilgrimage, or when I read it for the first time, I did rather sort of pass over Backwater, and for a long time I never considered it that important a volume. It wasn't one of my favorites. I mean, my favorites would probably be something like The Tunnel, or Dawn's Left Hand, or Evolving Lights, which are often the volumes that are taught and are looked to. But when I began to put together the scholarly edition, I became more and more interested in it, and I realized that just the act of putting Pointed Roofs and Backwater in the same volume put them into contrast, and that's actually something Richardson would have really really approved of, because she talks about reading Proust, and she hadn't read Proust at this point at all, but she talks about reading Proust from beginning to end and back to front and diving into the middle and almost reading both ways. And I think in retrospect, she was thinking that that's how she wanted people to read Pilgrimage, that you could divide it up in different ways, and the individual sections and chapters are very important, and that she didn't want a linear narrative. One of the reasons she absolutely hated the metaphor of stream of consciousness, I think, is because it implies this linear narrative of A to B. So when you put Pointed Roofs and Backwater together, what you get is really a series of contrasts. That Pointed Roofs is a very light, I think, optimistic, it's a journey narrative. Miriam is leaving home, not under the best of circumstances. Obviously, her father's going bankrupt, but she goes to a new culture. She finds it exciting despite the restrictions of Waldstrasse and the school, and she really feels like she's going somewhere and getting somewhere. Backwater, as the title suggests, is exactly the opposite. This is about Miriam as stuck. Of course, she is still very young, and we're really reminded of that at the beginning in the wonderful omnibus ride where she goes from North London down to Piccadilly and then over the river to Barnes. But when she comes out of the interview with the Perns, she has that really familiar teenage reaction. Oh, Mum, you've really embarrassed me. Why did you say all those things? And suddenly we kind of realize just how young she is, only 17 at that point. And we actually experience her 18th birthday, which is a kind of, it's never mentioned as such, but it's a kind of coming out party. So here's a young woman just maturing, just entering adulthood. Her mother says, oh, she's only put her hair up last week, and the Perns say, oh, but she didn't need to do that, can't she stay a girl? And so she's very much at that stage, and yet she's stuck. The optimism, I think, of Pointed Roofs passes away, and it's a very different kind of novel geographically. I mean, she travels to a different country, to a different culture. She moves into a really cosmopolitan milieu in Pointed Roofs, where people are speaking French and German and English, and often simultaneously, and mixing up the languages. And we even have Low German dialect spoken by the servants, which apparently she reproduces phonetically really well. But here, a key word is dingy. Everything is dingy, a bit grimy. She doesn't like the North London accent. I mean, people would say now Finsbury Park, which is the what Banbury Park is analogous to. People would say Finsbury Park is a pretty nice place, but she's come from Barnes in South London, which is really lovely. I mean, very, very, very beautiful and suburban and near the river and near the park. So this is gritty North London, lower class, and Miriam is a bit of a snob. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about it. Her prejudices are kind of there for all of us to see, and she's not aware of them at all. And I mean, one of the extraordinary things about Richardson's method is the way that we only really perceive things the way through Miriam's perception of the world, and for that reason her prejudices are kind of unmediated and often quite offensive. I mean, the way she thinks about the young Jewish girl in the school, for example, or her reactions to the blackface minstrels in Brighton. These are the kind of unthinking reactions of a young middle-class woman Christian woman in the 1890s. And it's only, I mean, Richardson had her own prejudices, but it's only as Miriam matures and develops and is able to reflect on herself and also interacts with other people that she becomes aware of those prejudices, whereas we as the reader come up against them rather freshly, I think. I think it's also an interesting study in mental states. I think Miriam is depressed. There's some indication that she might have tuberculosis, and she's encouraged to go for walks in the park. So one of the extracts that I've given you is one of those walks, because at the time, if you were thought to be tubercular, then fresh air was thought to be restorative. And she's also, I think, bored. And people have written about Richardson's representation of boredom. But here being bored is a kind of almost waiting. I can't remember who it is. I think it's Walter Benjamin describes boredom as waiting for desire. Okay, it's not that you have a desire and it's not fulfilled, but you're waiting for desire to arrive. And that seems to be very much the case for Miriam. And she doesn't know what her desires might be, but one of the things that is characteristic of the young Miriam is she's very clear what they are not. She is, without doubt, repelled by conventional femininity. And this sometimes comes across as a kind of misogyny. She says at times that her father didn't like women and she doesn't either. But what it really seems to be for Miriam is that she doesn't like conventional femininity, and she doesn't like the idea that she's going to end up either as an old maid, and that term OM is used in relation to the Pern sisters at the beginning, but it's also, I think, a terrible fear for Miriam herself. And in one of the passages that I've given you, she sees this kind of bundled up woman figure in the park, and doesn't realize to the last minute that it's Jenny Pern. And I read that as a kind of image of her own fears, of that she will herself become that person. The other figure that she sees in the park, in the second extract that I gave you, we're told how she's just been reading romantic literature, which is something she does a lot in the novel, and is one of her escapes from her boring life and her depression. And she sees a man, and we're told that her heart kind of reaches out to this man, and then there's a kind of terrible disappointment when he just turns out to be a clerk in his bowler hat and with his briefcase going home from work. And that I read as the fear of the suburban marriage, the thing that she's been trying to get away from, and she thinks she's escaped from when she goes to Germany. And there's the poor old Ted Burton, who I think is the person for whom she plays Abide With Me in Pointed Roofs, and then he appears again clearly as her suitor, but she almost rubs his nose in it by going off with Max Sonnenschein, who of course is this much more cosmopolitan Jewish figure, much more the desirable figure who might have come out of Pointed Roofs than the people she finds, or the idea she has of a suburban marriage. But I think the problem that Richardson is trying to write for Miriam is that the kind of woman that she wants to be, the kind of independent femininity that she wants, simply she has no models. There are no models for a young woman in the 1890s. There are romantic heroines. There's the idea of the suburban marriage. There's the old maids. And she knows she wants to be none of those things, but she doesn't know what she does want to do. The new woman emerges again, I think, when it's suggested that she become a writer, and she becomes at once that she might become a slightly what's the word I'm looking for? Racy kind of writer, but of course that idea is also imposed on her by a man. It doesn't fit with what she wants to be. The other side of this depression, though, is an engagement with popular culture that we don't find at all in Pointed Roofs. I mean, Pointed Roofs is very much a kind of domestic novel of interiors, whereas Backwater is beginning to open out, both in terms of a kind of broadening of London, but also these wider spaces like the move to Brighton and Crystal Palace, both of which are spaces of pleasure and entertainment in the Victorian period. So there is some kind of expansion. And there's a sense in which there might be a more public sphere in which she could interact. Again, it's not a terribly I think it's not a terribly attractive public sphere to Miriam, but she begins to realize that there could be another Miriam to the domestic interior Miriam, that there could be a performative Miriam. And I think that's one of the things that she sees in the blackface minstrels, but also, although people often write about how that there's not much sex and there's not much that's corporeal in pilgrimage, there's actually a lot beneath the surface. There's all this talk in Brighton about the young women that her sister and her fiance talk about, which is really about public sex and what other women get up to, and that's something that Miriam's beginning to engage with. And one of the reasons that I've picked out the passage about the circus, which is a kind of transformative and moment in what is otherwise a quite, I think, dark and depressed novel, is because it's almost as if Miriam suddenly imagines herself as on that stage, as somehow free from what everybody else thinks of her and domestic possibilities. Mr. Parrow, of course, is who she meets on the walk to Ovingdean, is the image of what she might have to settle for. And you know, again, like Ted Burton, we can't help feeling a little bit sorry for Mr. Parrow, who's clearly fallen for her. At the same time, his limitations are so obvious, and also that his mind moves so quickly to marriage. This idea of how much you could live on. Now, again, Miriam's prejudices are very clear here. The idea of Brixton. Of non-conformism, of his little house. But Mr. Parrow does again offer the possibility of release, but may not have done for the first readers. So the novel ends with a much more upbeat trip to Crystal Palace, and Crystal Palace, of course, was a great centre of entertainment for the Victorians in the late 19th century. It had originally been part of the Great Exhibition in the 1850s and then was moved to South London, and we hear of the extraordinary kind of organ and the orchestra space and these huge set piece firework displays, which Miriam herself doesn't like because of the noise, which doesn't like the noise, but she likes it. And there's that moment where they escape and they go down the helter-skelter or the slide, and they hold hands at the end. And it feels like this is setting up the novel for the trilogy in which Miriam will marry Mr. Parrow, or her life of romance has begun and she will find someone else. And I think what's wonderful about the novel is that Mr. Parrow disappears entirely. We never hear about him ever again. What Richardson seems to be trying to do is, through a series of failed relationships or role models that simply don't work for Miriam, she's setting up the possibility of something else, which is not available to the reader and is not available to Miriam, but will gradually emerge as pilgrimage progresses. But just to finish, it's interesting that critics like Jo Winning and Mandy Merck have found signs of another sexuality within the novel. And that comes partly through Miriam's reading, romantic reading. As another critic has pointed out, it all happens at night. It's almost as if Miriam steals the night for herself. It's a place in which she can be herself, and her life is not subject to the demands of the school or the children in the school. In both situations, she's forced to become a carer, to take up a traditional feminine role. But by depriving herself of sleep and sitting up reading, she creates a space in which she's not a carer. Even if it's a very confined space. But there is this focus on her hands, and Miriam always tells us that she has these very large masculine or maybe androgynous hands, and Miriam thinks a lot about how uncomfortable she is with femininity, and is she the third son that her father wanted? Is she later on, when she's read a bit more sexology, she thinks about, is she the third sex? But as Joe Winning suggests, this suggests the idea of a kind of emergent self-pleasuring of a same-sex sexuality, which is born in that space at night, which is mentioned. The idea is mentioned once in the novel when the teachers are talking about two girls who have unnatural desires or an unnatural friendship. So the possibility of same sexuality is there. It's one of the other possibilities that is there for Miriam. But this is a novel about non-realization, about failure, about dead ends, about a backwater, and that's what I found so interesting about it now.
Thank you so much, Scott, for that. I think I have to say for myself that when I first read the book, frankly, Backwater seemed like a holding space for me. Like I was waiting to move on. And rereading it this time, I just am amazed how much there is going on there. It really is. It's like many foundations that become for issues and aspects of Miriam's life that are developed later in the course of the chapters or the books. Are laid in Backwater, really more than in Pointed Roofs. Pointed Roofs is really kind of her first engagement out in the world, whereas here you see her having, the thoughts about, is this my life? Is this what I'm resigned to? And I think one of the things, I'll just say that one of the things I find really special about this book and why I feel like it really deserves a much wider audience is it is such an example of a woman trying to, a single young woman trying to carve a place in the world that isn't based on a preset paradigm, and how difficult that is. Even when she does become a writer, okay, she has exposure to the H.G. Wells-like figure of a writer, but what other female independent single women writers does she run across in her life? She doesn't. And she has to, in effect, come up with a completely new answer. And, just how difficult that is and how courageous that is. And yet we're living in a world where many people are saying, I don't want to pick off, I don't want to pick my life approach off of the Chinese menu. I'll pick one from, okay, I will be heterosexual, I'll get married, I'll have a job, etc. Many more people are choosing not to pick off the, pre-dictated menu and creating their own identities. And I think this book speaks so much to that. I wanted to start, if I can, just by throwing in a couple of questions that came up in the course of the last month or so. One of them was raised by Rebecca, and who's joined us today, and that's the question, Rebecca Mooney, and that is, how did Richardson go about recreating this life, which was like 20 years in the past for her? Did she, I mean, I've never seen any mention that she had a diary or a journal or notes. I mean, how did she go through that reconstruction process?
That's a great question, and it's fascinated me too. The late Laura Marcus was convinced there must have been diary or notebooks somewhere. I'm not sure there necessarily were. I mean, you can see from her letters that she had an extraordinary power of recall. And often when she writes letters to different people about the same event, she kind of works and reworks the same scene. For me, the key kind of insight to that is the omnibus journey, and I'm fascinated by public transport in London. And the omnibus journey is exactly the journey that she could have taken in the 1890s, with all the little landmarks there. But interestingly, some of the landmarks wouldn't have been there when the novel is set. They're like, two of the theatres are built after the novel is set, and she merges all three different theatres into one. So it isn't an exact reproduction of what Richardson herself might have seen on that bus journey. It's a kind of palimpsest and of the 1890s and the early 20th century. And it's almost as if she imposes one on the other. And I've always found it quite useful to make a distinction between immediate experience and the experience of immediacy. And I think Richardson isn't so interested in recreating the exact immediate experience of Miriam's perceptions, but the experience of immediacy for the reader. So as if the reader can understand what it's like for Miriam to experience it for the first time. And that's borne out by the fact that Richardson often said that she thought you didn't really understand, you couldn't really investigate reality until you started writing about it. So it is not an immediate, it's not a form of immediate art or instant art. It's a form of reflection or contemplation. Those terms, reflection and contemplation, are really, really important for her. Though I know I can see Max is here, and he in his wonderful book on Impressionism has a lot more to say about that.
Well, thank you for that, Scott. Did you want us to pick one of the passages and do a kind of a group reading like we did last time around, or do folks want to jump in and start taking advantage of our access to such expertise on
I would just
Backwater?
I would just love to hear what people think about it. I really would, actually. That would make me very happy.
Okay. If you have a question for Scott, feel free to go off mute and just toss it out. Let's see where this discussion goes.
Hello?
Yes?
Hi, it's Phyllis. There I am in the
Okay.
dark. I didn't want to muddy the waters, but I just can't stand it. I'm reading Villette at the same time I've been reading Dorothy Richardson. And I don't want to, if this doesn't ring any bells for anybody, you can skip it, but sometimes I get them mixed up. I mean, the tone and the depression and the what are you going to do with yourself in this certain time of the world. So I wondered if there's any, I know there's been academic discussion. I don't know if there's anything in experiencing both of those that can inform the Richardson stuff.
Just to clarify, you're talking about Villette, the novel Villette.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question, Phyllis, because when Brad was saying, sort of echoing that point about Miriam having no sort of female models, I mean, it's not the case that Richardson, I mean, she's definitely dissatisfied with the 19th century novel and certainly with men's novels, and actually with a lot of women novelists as well. But the one novelist who seems to please her is Charlotte Bronte. And of course, Pointed Roofs and Villette are, well, Pointed Roofs is a kind of rewriting of Villette. And I think that's interesting, because it does suggest that even if the young Miriam doesn't have as the kinds of models that she wants, Richardson sees something in Bronte that offers her not an exact model, but maybe a starting point for the kind of femininity that she wants to explore. Yeah.
Well, Scott, tell us, I mean, how did you come, what got you started on the pilgrimage Richardson path?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I think must have come a point when, I mean, I did my thesis on gender and narrative, sort of 1880 to 1920, and I'd always intended to go a little bit further, but as with a lot of PhD students, I'd bitten off more than I could chew, and I never really got into modernism in a big way. And I just thought, at a certain point, I want to sit down and read lots of modernist women writers, because it wasn't something I'd done, and it wasn't something that I'd particularly been taught. And at the time, I lived in a socialist feminist household in North London, and they had shelves and shelves and shelves of all kinds of books, but lots of green covers of all the viragos. And so it was a great opportunity to start reading. And for some reason, Richardson just pulled me in, and I don't know that I can explain it any better than that. But I remember Jill Hanscombe, who wrote one of the earlier studies, a wonderful study on Richardson. I remember her saying, what's it like reading it as a man? And I think the implication was, can you read it as a man? Because it is so clearly a novel that is centered around women. And I had to think about that for a bit. And I eventually said, well, the thing about Miriam is she is so uncomfortable in her gender identity. And I think everybody is fairly uncomfortable in their gender identity. So it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, what you can identify with, or what you can understand, is Miriam's discomfort with the way society wants her to be a woman, because that discomfort with gender identity is kind of universal, even whether we admit it or not. So that was one aspect, but the other aspect was my love of London, I think. And it is, I mean, at one point she says, my mighty lover, London. So Miriam doesn't find a man, but she finds a city, and that becomes her lover. And I do think that Pilgrimage is a kind of love poem to the city, and to London in particular. And I'm very attracted to that. And there are particular walks and journeys that Miriam takes within London that I go back to again and again and again.
Speaking of one of the walks, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can.
Oh, and I'm sorry, I'm not very technologically challenged. I can't even see if you can see me.
We can.
Oh, okay, good. This is Rebecca Mooney. I'm on page 207 in the Virago, and she's gone on a walk. It's the first partial paragraph, and she talks about, I believe she's seeing Ted through the window, and Ted of the white suit, Ted. And I think that, she imagines that one day he's going to kiss her. Do you recall the passage I'm talking about? I think it's not too far into chapter 2 in Backwater. I can't hear anybody.
Yes, I know where you mean.
Okay. That particular passage, it really sounds like she is totally smitten by Ted. And I have always, this is my first time through. I believe that she really is stuck on Ted, but that she's afraid to show him that in Pointed Roofs. And thus she diverts herself with Max. And I don't know if she's playing a "can I make him jealous" game or something like that, but I don't know that. Are you saying that she's rejected Ted, that she doesn't really like Ted? Because I see love for Ted.
I don't see love for Ted. I see love for the fact that Ted likes her. I think that's what I liked about Ted.
Okay.
That whole thing about, you know, play abide with me, where she kind of imagines how Ted is going to feel when she's no longer there, and how he's going to miss her. And of course, part of that is just a kind of displacement of her own fears and worries about going away, and a kind of project how she will be homesick. But I think, I mean, that's why I say poor Ted, because I think she's kind of experimenting with Ted, but
yes.
The last thing she wants is actually to marry Ted. Because that would, I mean, Miriam doesn't like anything that fixes her. She doesn't like political ideologies that fix her. She doesn't like religions that fix her. She doesn't like relationships that fix her. She never wants to be tied down. And I think that probably starts with Ted.
I could further that point in this very same passage, because she does go on to say that she would forget it, that it had not touched her, and it's almost like she feels connected to him but rejects it and pushes it away, and constantly I don't know, a sort of a rubber band kind of effect. But okay, thank you.
What I'd also offer is, I think if you recall, there's that scene in Pointed Roofs where I think it's Harriet who compliments or essentially remarks on the fact that she thinks Miriam is beautiful, and Miriam's kind of like, wow, you really, you know, they really like me. And this is really her first sense that there's a man who would be interested in me, you know. And it's kind of, you know, in fact, in Pointed Roofs, when I've read that now a couple of times, I always think of the Sally Field Oscar acceptance speech. You know, you like me, you really, really like me. That's kind of, you know, she is a young woman having that first sense that there is somebody out there who would find me attractive. On the other hand, I think, you know, we see again and again her saying kind of like, gosh, that's such a little box that I can't put myself into. You know, that box of, you know, being just somebody's wife and waiting for him to come come home from work across the park. And that wonderful scene where she watches the man walking across the park after she's consumed all of these romantic novels that have a certain paradigm, right? The man will walk in, you know, in all of those novels, there's some sort of accidental, you know, it's like romantic comedies today, rom-coms. There's some accidental, you know, encounter out of which suddenly, you know, happiness emerges at the end of the book. And it doesn't work for her.
I think Kristen wants to come in.
Yes, Kristen, please.
Hi, I'm afraid to turn on a video because my Airbnb internet is so unstable.
Okay.
So just wave your hands wildly if I start breaking up horribly. Just let me know. But I just wanted to say that I'm reading the novel like, I don't know, an Airbnb suburban guest in now Newcastle, and not as a scholar, because I'm not publishing on Richardson. I haven't read Richardson scholarship. And it's so interesting to me to see at the beginning of Backwater my own reactions, because at the dance with Ted, I'm like, no, don't do it. You're an idiot. Don't let him go. Like, wow, what's this about? I was 20 reading this novel. I was really excited. So it's just interesting now that I can see the heavy late Victorian investments in conventional suburban marriage that she is essentially sacrificing in the pit of poverty. I mean, the poverty facing them is so desperate. And I'm scared for her. Like, I can just read it as I would when I was in high school before I became a professional reader, and really deep identification still with her, but just saying, don't give him up. He's your ticket. He's your safety. And then I read the biographies. I'm like, this Alan Odell guy is so weird. What did she do with her life? You know, and she dies in obscurity. It's awful. So at any rate, Scott, whatever you want, however you might want to respond to that.
No, I think there's so much going on with the young Miriam. I think Brad's absolutely right. She doesn't think of herself as attractive. She doesn't have a very strong sense of self at all. I mean, there's that carriage ride with Pastor Lerman where she just stares at him the whole time, and then she seems to be completely unconscious of the fact that he's making some kind of advance when he's suggesting that she wears her glasses, and he like makes this idea, raises the idea of the ideal wife, which disgusts her. But of course, Fraulein Pfaff sees that as it's unclear whether she's protecting her or whether she's jealous, but it's one of the reasons that Miriam has to leave, because there's a rage. And actually, I mean, the school in Pointed Roofs is just kind of this welling over kind of cauldron of desire that breaks out in giggles and walks and encounters with students. But it seems to me that Miriam is really cut off in Backwater, though. And I wish I'd picked it as one of the passages now. There is that really interesting scene where she goes to visit Grace Broom, and she's sitting in that really heavy Victorian interior with the porcelain and the hangings and the rugs and the big picture on the wall, which I can't identify. And the servant comes in, and she's called Vashti, and she pours the wine, and they're really horrible to her. And this is something that this is one of the really wonderful things about Miriam, despite her prejudices, that she really starts to notice servants, both in Germany and in the Perns house, in a way she never has before, because she is also a worker, and she suddenly starts to see other people's labor, and so she's very aware of Vashti and the way the servant and the way everybody else isn't. But Vashti is this queen who rebels in the Bible, and she's also a figure in Villette, the very glamorous actress on the stage. So there are all these ideas and symbolic figurations of women that are going on again in the text, in what is in fact a really dense text. But Miriam, just as she's trapped in that interior in Grace Broom's house, she just can't break out of, I think, at this point, except in her imagination and in romantic literature. Max, are you?
Yes, please, Max.
Hello, Scott. Sorry, I'm afraid I'm having trouble with the video as well. My internet connection is unstable and it keeps freezing if I have it on. But I really love what you were saying about a lot of things in the novel, particularly that account of the sense of boredom and depression in it. I found myself being quite disturbed by the negativity in it at various points, and that sort of helped me think about what was going on there. But I suppose the thing I wanted to comment on really was something else that seems to sort of come up again and again very powerfully in it, and sort of increasingly powerfully, I think, which is that sense of, precisely of her beginning to feel a sense of her own identity. I mean, I think you said something about this in your opening remarks. I mean, the passage that really blew me away this time around was when she's reading the newspaper at the Perns school. And it's extraordinary, isn't it? Where she, I mean, partly because of the sense it gives of how circumscribed her life must have been up until then, she raised her head at last. No wonder people read newspapers. You could read about what was going on in the country, actually what the government was doing at that very moment, you know, and you sort of think, how had she not done that before or thought of that before? But she does. And then, you know, she goes on for about 2 pages having thoughts like that, and it ends up with her saying, I'm alive. You know, as if she hadn't really felt that before until this sense of kind of the possibilities of the world opens out for her like that. And and she does it so brilliantly, doesn't she? I mean, just the kind of cascade of thoughts that follow from that initial opening of the newspaper is incredibly powerful, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, it's really interesting the way she has associated newspapers up until that point with her father. And her father read the Times leaders. And I think, isn't there an indication that her father lets her mother read, but there's a sense in which her mother reading the newspaper is nothing like the sort of patriarchal authority of the father with his scientific papers. But also there's a kind of meta discussion going on there as well, because it's about the Royal Commission on Education that the Perns suggest she read, and this idea that actually Miriam is thinking all the time about what education should be. And this is a discussion that begins in her mind as she compares the Waldstrasse school with its terribly kind of disorganized curriculum and the German masters who aren't really interested in the girls' education, with her own education, which has been this quite very unusual Ruskin-influenced education in art and music in South London. But what she finds, of course, in the Perns school is this learning by rote, and that there's a wonderful moment, sort of akin to that moment that Lawrence describes, of when the classroom takes off, of when the kind of moments of in between learning, when she feels she has the children's attention and things are allowed to wander a little bit, and that's where she starts to see what learning might really be. So I mean, I haven't discussed it at all, but I just think the novel is really interesting about education as well, as well as, and yet Miriam hasn't really thought that much about it. But in what she's doing and what isn't working, it's all there.
I want to take a moment to bring up a question that was asked in the chat from Jennifer Braun about Miriam's religious views, which we first got a good exposure to in Pointed Roofs, but it comes back particularly both in another session in church and her discussion with Miss Hattie in her little room. And just if you can, I mean, the question is, was that not a relatively unusual attitude for a middle-class young woman to be taking at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a particularly religious person, and I often find the spiritual element of Richardson probably the most difficult to engage with. I want to explain it in other ways, but there's absolutely no doubt that it's there. I was just, I'm sorry, I wasn't listening to the question properly because I was reading Karen Horowitz's comment about how, although she doesn't have a strong sense of self socially, she has this strong sense inside herself of being alive. And it's that essential idea of being, which Richardson writes about later, that Miriam feels first in the garden moments, the garden scene, when it's sometimes called the bee scene, where she's stung by the bee when she's little, which is the first moment where she has a sense of self, and how the moments when Miriam really comes into herself are all connected right across the narrative to some other sense of being, which is without doubt spiritual, I think. And one of the reasons that she found writing so difficult to begin with is that she found that all the stuff in the world, all the context, was getting in the way of this essential truth. And it's not a truth that Miriam has access to all the time, but it is there all the time, I think. So it's not any form of organized religion. It may not be religion at all, but it's definitely spiritual. Yeah, it's definitely spiritual. But I think maybe Jennifer was saying, is saying her religious views. It's true that her rejection of the idea of God is incredibly unusual for the period, and that really marks her out, and would have actually made her unemployable in a lot of schools if she hadn't kept quiet about it. So it's strangely contradictory. She says she's an atheist, but she's also deeply spiritual.
Well, I think also, oh, go ahead, please, Karen.
Oh, I was just going to say something I've been tracking as I've been reading these two books, the first two books, is her use of the word it. And I noticed that when she has those moments of spiritual access, she often starts talking about it. And I just sort of marked them in the books, but I wondered if you'd noticed that, or if anyone here has picked up on that. And I also wondered about Richardson's interest in Eastern philosophy, because these moments of connection that Miriam expresses are actually quite related to certain types of Hinduism. So I just wondered if there was any connection there in the background.
Well, that's a really, I mean, the question of the pronoun, I think, is really interesting. Do you think it is a state,
Yeah.
a state of being, right? Yeah, rather than
yeah,
than a static position.
In
Yeah.
in Hinduism, there's a very famous phrase which is "I am that," and I feel when Miriam goes into these moments of connection, she is expressing that. And I think that's what you were just talking about when you're talking about that sort of life energy, that it's a sort of whether it's connecting with the force of nature. It's not conventional Christianity by any means. It's really interesting.
Let me just add, I think it's important to remember that before writing Pilgrimage, she had written about the Quakers, and Quakerism becomes a big factor later in the book. And it's almost like what's going on is a rejection of, you know, a view of religion, but also the church that, you know, has its roots going back very, very long way, that a whole great chain of being sort of idea that everybody has their place. And what she's trying to establish, I think, is the kind of sense of autonomy, the individual relationship with God, in whatever you put that term, which is very much closer to what what essentially the Quakers were saying, which was that we'll provide a space and it's for you to establish this relationship on your own. So I just bear in mind that Quakerism is a big factor for Richardson as well.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any direct sort of interest in Eastern religion, but it wouldn't be at all surprising given how popular various versions of Eastern religion were, particularly in the kind of alternative circles that Richardson hung out with at the time. Yeah. But it does seem that it's coming partly through Quakerism, but also through people like Evelyn Underhill, who write about spirituality and the idea of the spiritual journey and the importance of contemplation. These ideas seem to feed into Pilgrimage, I think.
Was she connected with the Theosophists at all?
Again, I don't think she was, but the circles in which she moved, Theosophy would have. I mean, the thing to do would be to go and look at George Thompson's notes to Pilgrimage and look up Theosophy and the various key people. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're there somewhere. But I'm sure. I mean, she read so much. I mean, generally, it's kind of wiser to assume that she has read something rather than she hasn't. So it's possible, and I think it would be a really interesting path to pursue, actually.
I'm just looking in Windows for Modernism. She does actually mention Rudolf Steiner, at least in one letter. So she was certainly aware of him. Yeah.
Great.
We're really at the hour, so I just want to bring up a great question that James Kelly put in the chat, which is about the fact that 30 years after Backwater, one of the Miss Perns reached out to get in contact with Dorothy Richardson, and raising the question, did Richardson have any particular qualms or reservations or scruples about the fact that she was writing about so many people who had real life counterparts?
I doubt it. I mean, she certainly had no worries about writing about Wells as Hypo Wilson. I mean, she probably felt this needed taking down a peg or two. As for sort of less well-known people, I'm not. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think George Thompson has got a piece in the Richardson Journal that he wrote where he did actually follow up and find out who the Perns.
Yeah,
Perns were.
right,
And
right. The Ayre sisters.
Yeah, the Ayre sisters, exactly. And that she's clearly in her letters very fond of them and very affectionate. And yet I think in Backwater, we really get the sense that they are exactly what she doesn't want to be. And that comes over almost as dislike, but that isn't how she remembers them in real life. So maybe she didn't think that they would be offended in this particular case. And there are very few malicious portrayals of people, I think, in Pilgrimage. I mean, people may not have liked how they were portrayed, but it would be maybe hard to take offense.
There's a nice, there was something, I think it was published in the Richardson Journal, Anthony West's memoirs of visiting Richardson, and then later talking about it. Of course, his mother was Rebecca West, his father was H.G. Wells, and his essentially reporting his visit to H.G. Wells, and Wells saying essentially, oh, that woman is the most, something to the effect of, she's the most antisocial person I've ever met. So I think she, part of her getting into a space that she could create this work was really to ignore a lot of people.
I think that's right. But I wouldn't trust anything Wells said.
We probably should wrap up here, but are there any other questions that folks want to ask? I could go on for a couple of hours if you let me loose, but if you do want to either raise your hand or ask it in the chat.
Chris, I totally agree. Yeah, I don't think she dislikes the Miss Perns any more than she likes women, even though she says she does. She likes the version of femininity or the version of the old maid they represent. And you know what? They're not that old. They're actually in their 30s. So that's a bit shocking. But when you're 18, everybody seems old.
Yeah, I also just one thing that it completely passed me by, but the chapter where they're they're going up the river, and they're talking about all the ladies in the white clothing, and the fact that Miriam argues that this is all basically constructed by men about how they want women to appear, which I found kind of interesting, because you don't really, again, it's one of those things, I'm not well versed enough in the literature of this period, but I can't think of another example where a woman says it's a man making us dress like that.
Yeah. I mean, that idea of rational dress would have been very available in some of the suffragist literature, but obviously Miriam is not aware of that at that particular point.
Right. So let's see, just the last comment from Mikey. Money is becoming a bigger issue for Miriam. I assume this will continue. Absolutely. This is why I think it speaks so much to today's reader. Miriam faces very practical issues like, where can I afford to live? Can I afford to throw up my job? You will see that coming back and again, and in a way that I think very few novels focused on women in that period focus on the practical aspects of just getting by.
I think that's absolutely right. As yeah, room for a lot of discussion, more discussion about that, particularly later on.
Well, thank
you so much. That was so enjoyable. It's lovely to speak to other people about it.
I hope everybody's getting something. I mean, I love this book, but it's even better to be able to share it with other people because you get so many different perceptions about it. That for me, it's a tremendously enriching experience. So I thank you, Saul. And I really salute to Fergus for getting up in the wee hours to join us from Tasmania. So join us again next month when we'll be talking about Honeycomb, which really gets to be an interesting book in terms of immersing into the period, because that's where we get the Oscar Wilde reference from, among other things going on. So thank you, everybody. Please, if you have questions, ideas, feel free to contact me through the pilgrimage website, through the email address there, or just continue to share stuff on Twitter. That's really what's making this experience so wonderful. So thank you all so much. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.